The room shimmered with the golden glow of a late morning sun. Emily Parker adjusted her delicate lace veil for what felt like the 100th time, her reflection in the mirror glowing with anticipation. Today was the day she had dreamed of, the day she would become Mrs. Andrew Mason, wife to one of Seattle's most powerful and successful men. Everything was perfect. The ballroom downstairs had been decorated in elegant whites and golds, a fitting backdrop for a fairy tale wedding. The guest list included prominent figures from Seattle's elite, CEOs, politicians, and celebrities. Emily's heart raced as she imagined Andrew's smile when he saw her walking down the aisle. The rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall brought her back to reality. It was 11:30 a.m., and the ceremony would begin in just 30 minutes. She took a deep breath, her fingers trembling slightly as she adjusted the bouquet of white roses resting on a nearby table. Then the phone rang. She hesitated for a moment, glancing at her bridesmaids, who had stepped out to handle last-minute details. Picking up the phone, she pressed it to her ear. "Hello?" Her voice was soft, tinged with excitement. There was a pause. The silence stretched unnervingly long before Andrew's voice finally came through, cold and distant. "Emily, I can't do this." The words hit her like a freight train. What are you talking about?" she stammered, her grip tightening around the phone. "I'm sorry," he said, his tone clipped. "I've been thinking, and this isn't the right time. My company, it needs my full attention right now. You'll understand someday." She felt her chest tighten, as though the air had been stolen from the room. "Andrew, what are you saying? This is our wedding day." "I know," he replied, his voice flat. "But I can't go through with it. I'm sorry." And just like that, the line went dead. The phone slipped from her trembling fingers, landing on the plush carpet with a dull thud. Emily stared blankly at her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at her no longer seemed radiant and hopeful. Instead, she saw someone utterly lost, a bride without a groom, a love story without its ending. The pain of betrayal. As the minutes passed, the reality of Andrew's betrayal began to sink in. The fairy tale she had envisioned evaporated, leaving behind only raw, unbearable pain. She tore the veil from her head, the delicate lace crumpling to the floor, a silent symbol of the life she would no longer have. News of the canceled wedding spread quickly. Paparazzi swarmed the hotel, their flashing cameras capturing every moment of Emily's heartbreak as she stepped outside. Still in her wedding dress, she shielded her face with her bouquet, but the relentless questions followed her. "Emily, why did Andrew cancel the wedding? Is there someone else? How does it feel to be jilted by Seattle's golden boy?" Each question was like a dagger twisting in her heart. She kept walking, her heels clicking against the marble floor, refusing to let the tears spill until she was far from the crowd. The next morning, the headlines were merciless. Left at the altar, Andrew Mason cancels wedding to fiancée Emily Parker. Mason chooses career over love. Friends she had once considered close began to distance themselves, their loyalties shifting toward Andrew, who remained a dominant figure in Seattle's elite circles. Emily quickly realized she could not stay. The penthouse they had shared, once filled with laughter and plans for the future, now felt suffocatingly empty. Everywhere she turned, she saw remnants of a life that was no longer hers, a life she had built around Andrew and his promises. Starting over. Packing her belongings into a single suitcase, Emily left behind the glittering world of high society. She rented a modest apartment on the outskirts of Seattle, a stark contrast to the luxury she once knew. The creaking floors, chipped paint, and leaky faucets didn't bother her. They were a small price to pay for freedom from Andrew's shadow. She spent her days trying to rebuild her life. With no job and limited savings, Emily turned to her passion for writing, taking on small freelance assignments to make ends meet. The pay was meager, but it allowed her to maintain some semblance of independence. Late at night, when the world was quiet, she poured her emotions into the pages of a manuscript. Writing became her solace, a way to process the betrayal and rediscover herself. Still, the pain lingered. On rainy Seattle mornings, when the gray skies matched her mood, Emily would catch herself scrolling through news articles about Andrew. His name remained a constant in business headlines, his face gracing magazine covers with captions like "Visionary Leader" and "Seattle's Most Eligible Bachelor." Not once was she mentioned. Unfinished business. Months passed, and Emily slowly adjusted to her new reality. But one crisp autumn morning, as she sifted through her mail, she came across an elegant envelope embossed with the Mason family crest. Her heart skipped a beat. Inside was an invitation to an exclusive gala, accompanied by a handwritten note from Andrew. "Emily, I hope you'll consider attending. I'd like to see you there." Her mind raced. Why now? Did he want to apologize? Reconnect? Or was this just another display of his control, a way to remind her of the life she no longer had? Emily set the invitation on the counter, staring at it for a long moment. Part of her wanted to tear it up and throw it away. But another part, one she couldn't quite silence, needed answers. For months she had lived with the ghost of Andrew Mason haunting her every step. Perhaps it was time to confront him, to close the door on the past once and for all. Emily Parker adjusted the hem of her modest black dress, taking a steadying breath before stepping out of the cab. The grand venue towered above her, its lights twinkling like stars against the crisp Seattle sky. She clutched the invitation from Andrew Mason, now slightly crumpled from her nervous grip. Attending tonight went against every instinct she had, but she needed answers. Closure. As she entered, the opulence of the event hit her immediately. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the room, and the hum of polite laughter filled the air. Emily felt like an outsider. Her simple attire a stark contrast to the designer gowns and tailored suits around her. She spotted him quickly, Andrew Mason, standing near the center of the room, surrounded by a small circle of admirers. His sharp suit and easy smile were the same as ever, exuding charm and confidence. Emily's chest tightened, but she forced herself forward, weaving through the crowd until their eyes met. "Emily," he said, stepping away from the group. His smile faltered, replaced by something softer, almost regretful. "Andrew," she replied, her voice even. "You came. I needed to," she said simply. He gestured toward a quieter corner. "Can we talk?" Confronting the past. They moved to a balcony overlooking the city. The chilly autumn air nipped at Emily's skin, but she welcomed the cold. It sharpened her resolve. Andrew leaned against the railing, looking out over the twinkling lights of Seattle. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said after a moment, his voice low. Emily crossed her arms. "What did you expect, Andrew? That I'd ignore an invitation like this? That I'd forget you left me at the altar and humiliated me in front of the entire city?" He flinched, the mask of confidence slipping from his face. "I made a mistake," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I was doing the right thing, focusing on my career, but I hurt you. I know that now." "Hurt me?" Emily let out a bitter laugh. "Andrew, you didn't just hurt me. You shattered my life. Do you have any idea what it's like to be the woman everyone whispers about? To lose everything and have to start over from nothing?" He turned to face her fully, guilt etched into his features. "I thought about you every day after that phone call. I wanted to reach out, but I didn't know how. I didn't know if you'd ever forgive me." Emily met his gaze, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions churning inside her. "Forgiveness? This isn't about forgiveness, Andrew. This is about the choices we made. You chose your company over me, and I chose to move on." Andrew opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a voice interrupted them. "Enter Charlotte Reed." "There you are," came a smooth, confident voice. Emily turned to see Charlotte Reed, Andrew's fiancée, stepping onto the balcony. She was stunning, her figure draped in a crimson designer gown that seemed to radiate power. Charlotte's perfectly polished smile faltered for a moment when she saw Emily, but she quickly recovered, offering her a hand. "You must be Emily? I've heard so much about you." Emily hesitated before taking her hand briefly. "I'm sure you have." Charlotte's eyes flicked between Emily and Andrew, her smile widening, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Andrew's told me how difficult things were for you after the wedding. I can't imagine how hard that must have been." The condescension in her tone wasn't lost on Emily, but she kept her composure. "It was hard, but I survived." Charlotte tilted her head, as if amused by Emily's response. "Well, Andrew's lucky to have someone as strong as you in his past. It's not easy being with a man like him, is it?" Emily felt her jaw tighten, but refused to rise to the bait. "Not easy at all," she said calmly. Andrew shifted uncomfortably, running a hand through his hair. "Charlotte, maybe we should get back to the party," Charlotte interrupted. looping her arm through Andrew's. "Everyone's asking about you." She turned to Emily one last time, her gaze sharp and unyielding. "It was nice meeting you, Emily. Truly." Emily watched them leave, her heart pounding with a mix of anger and resolve. Charlotte's calculated politeness was nothing more than a veiled threat, and Emily knew it. A turning point. When the door to the balcony closed, Emily let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The conversation with Andrew had stirred emotions she thought she'd buried, but it also brought clarity. She didn't need Andrew's apologies or Charlotte's approval. For months, she had questioned her worth, but standing there, looking out over the city, Emily realized she had found something far more valuable than the life she lost: her independence. When she finally re-entered the ballroom, Andrew's eyes followed her. But she didn't look back. Instead, she slipped out the front doors, leaving the glittering party and its ghosts behind. As she walked into the crisp night air, Emily felt lighter. The chapter with Andrew Mason was finally closed, and she was ready to move forward. The morning light streamed into Emily Parker's modest apartment as she sat frozen on her couch. In her trembling hands was a plastic stick, and staring back at her was a second line, faint but undeniably there. Pregnant. Her heart pounded as disbelief swirled in her mind. How could this be happening now? She pressed a hand against her stomach, struggling to steady her breath. The memories of her last moments with Andrew Mason flickered through her mind, but she quickly pushed them away. Andrew was gone. He had walked out of her life, and now she was left to face this alone. But there was no time for wallowing. Emily forced herself to her feet, placed the test on the table, and whispered to herself, "This is my journey now, mine and the baby's." The next week, she found herself sitting in a sterile doctor's office. The rhythmic thumping of a heartbeat filled the room, and Emily's breath hitched as she saw the grainy black and white image on the ultrasound monitor. "There it is," the doctor said with a kind smile. But his brow furrowed slightly, and he adjusted the machine. "What is it?" Emily asked, her voice tight with nerves. He paused, then turned the monitor slightly toward her. "Emily, there are 4 heartbeats. You're carrying quadruplets." "Quadruplets?" she echoed in disbelief, her voice barely above a whisper. Her hands instinctively moved to her stomach as if trying to comprehend the miracle and the overwhelming responsibility that now lay within her, from overwhelmed to determined. As Emily left the doctor's office, the weight of her situation pressed down on her like a heavy fog. 4 babies. Not 1, but 4. How could she possibly do this alone? The doctor's question lingered in her mind. "Do you have a strong support system?" She wanted to laugh at the absurdity. Support system? Her parents were long gone, and the so-called friends from her former life had disappeared the moment Andrew broke off the engagement. And Andrew? He didn't even know she was pregnant. He didn't deserve to know. Tears threatened to spill as she walked back to her tiny apartment. But as she unlocked the door and stepped inside, the quiet stillness of her space brought clarity. The walls may have been chipped, the furniture worn, but it was hers. This was where she would start again. Emily sat on the edge of her bed, her hands resting protectively over her stomach. "We'll figure it out," she whispered, her voice trembling but resolute. "No matter how hard it gets, I'll fight for all of you." Preparing for a new reality. Over the next few weeks, Emily threw herself into preparing for her baby's arrival. The cramped apartment she once resented became a bustling workshop of activity. Second-hand cribs lined the walls, piles of baby clothes spilled onto the floor, and every surface seemed covered with bottles, diapers, and pacifiers she had managed to buy from thrift stores. Her modest freelance income barely stretched far enough, but Emily was resourceful. She picked up extra writing assignments, often working late into the night despite her growing exhaustion. Each kick from her babies reminded her why she couldn't afford to stop. The physical toll of carrying quadruplets quickly became evident. Simple tasks like climbing the stairs to her apartment or walking to the grocery store left her breathless and aching. On some days, she could barely stand long enough to cook herself a meal. Still, she pressed on. Her neighbors, Betty and Frank, began to notice her growing belly and quietly stepped in to help. Betty, a kind older woman, often left homemade meals at Emily's door, while Frank offered to carry her groceries or fix anything that broke in her apartment. Their kindness was a lifeline during a time when Emily felt more alone than ever. Each night, as she lay in bed, Emily whispered to her unborn children. "You're my everything now," she said softly, her hands resting on her stomach. "I'll give you the best life I can." Glimpses of hope. Amid the chaos. As Emily's due date approached, the challenges mounted, but so did her determination. She spent hours researching high-risk pregnancies and raising multiples, filling notebooks with tips and advice. Her world revolved around the tiny lives growing inside her, and while fear still crept in during quiet moments, it was often overshadowed by hope. There were times when she felt the weight of it all, financial worries, the loneliness of doing this on her own, but she reminded herself that every sacrifice was for them. One evening, as Emily folded tiny onesies by the dim light of a thrift store lamp, she allowed herself a moment of pride. She had survived the heartbreak, the public humiliation, and now, against all odds, she was preparing to welcome 4 lives into the world. It wasn't the life she had planned, but it was hers. Ending on a powerful note, Emily sat on the edge of her bed that night, gazing at the cribs she had painstakingly assembled. The journey ahead was daunting, but as she pressed a hand to her belly and felt a fluttering kick, she smiled. "We've got this," she whispered. "I'll make sure of it." The sharp pain hit Emily Parker in the middle of the night, jolting her awake. At first, she thought it was just another discomfort from her pregnancy. Her body had been aching for weeks now. But as the pain intensified, her breath quickened, and a wave of fear washed over her. Grabbing her phone, Emily called her neighbors, Betty and Frank, who arrived within minutes to help her to the hospital. "It's too early," Emily whispered, her voice trembling as Betty held her hand in the back seat of Frank's car. "You're going to be fine, dear," Betty said gently, though the worry in her eyes betrayed her calm tone. At the hospital, the medical staff sprang into action. The room buzzed with urgency as doctors and nurses monitored Emily's condition. At just 32 weeks pregnant, it was far too soon, but there was no stopping the labor. "Emily," one of the doctors said, his voice steady despite the chaos, "we're going to do everything we can to make sure the babies are healthy. You need to stay calm and trust us, okay?" Emily nodded, clutching the edges of the hospital bed. Fear and determination clashed in her mind as the hours stretched on. If you're inspired by Emily's courage, make sure to like this video and subscribe for the next chapter in her journey, 4 Tiny Lives. As dawn broke, Emily's life changed forever. Noah was the first to arrive, his tiny cry filling the room and bringing tears to her eyes. Then came Liam, followed by Ethan and Owen. Each baby weighed barely over 3 pounds, their fragile bodies quickly whisked away to the NICU. Emily barely had the strength to speak, but she managed to ask, "Are they okay?" A nurse placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "They're fighters, Emily, just like their mom." Exhaustion claimed her as she was wheeled into recovery, but even in her haze, her mind stayed on her 4 sons. She hadn't even held them yet, but she already felt a fierce, unshakable love for each one. When she finally saw them, nestled in their tiny incubators and surrounded by machines that monitored their every heartbeat, Emily's breath caught. They were so small, so vulnerable, but they were hers. "You're perfect," she whispered, pressing a hand against the glass. "All of you." Imagine holding your children for the first time under such circumstances. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to hit the notification bell to follow Emily's journey. Adjusting to a new reality. After weeks in the NICU, Emily was finally able to bring her boys home. But the transition was anything but easy. Her tiny apartment, once quiet and organized, now felt chaotic and cramped. The sound of crying babies filled every corner, and the piles of bottles, diapers, and laundry seemed endless. Emily quickly realized there was no time to dwell on exhaustion. The babies needed her around the clock, feeding, changing, soothing. Nights blurred into days, and her once meticulous schedule became a jigsaw puzzle of naps and wake-ups. Her neighbors, Betty and Frank, continued to be her saving grace. Betty often came over to help with feedings, and Frank fixed anything that broke, from the crib screws to the apartment's leaky faucet. "I don't know what I'd do without you two," Emily admitted one afternoon, as she rocked Ethan to sleep while Betty burped Owen. "You're doing the hard part, dear," Betty said, her voice filled with admiration. We're just here to remind you that you're not alone. Feeling inspired by the kindness of strangers? Don't forget to share this video to remind others of the power of community. Finding joy amid the chaos. Despite the challenges, there were moments that made it all worthwhile. Emily found herself marveling at the little things: Noah's curious gaze, Liam's infectious giggle, Ethan's fascination with lights, and Owen's soothing presence that calmed his brothers during even the loudest meltdowns. Each milestone felt like a victory. The first time Noah smiled, Emily cried tears of joy. When Liam held his bottle on his own, she snapped a picture to send to Betty and Frank. Her freelance work became a lifeline, not just financially, but emotionally. She wrote during the boys' nap times, pouring her thoughts and experiences into words. Slowly, her articles gained traction, and her determination to provide for her sons grew stronger with every paycheck. But there were still moments of doubt. One evening, as Emily sat in the dimly lit apartment, surrounded by the chaos of toys and bottles, she felt the weight of it all. "Am I doing enough?" she whispered to herself, her voice cracking. "Will this ever get easier?" Almost as if in answer, Noah stirred in his crib, letting out a soft coo. Emily crossed the room and picked him up, cradling him in her arms. His tiny hand reached up, grasping her finger with surprising strength. Her doubts melted away in that instant. "We've got this," she whispered. "All of us." Emily's journey is a testament to the strength of a mother's love. Don't miss the next chapter. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications to follow this inspiring story. Reflection and hope. The days turned into weeks, and Emily's life settled into a new kind of rhythm. It wasn't easy. There were still sleepless nights and financial struggles, but she found strength in her boys and the small victories they celebrated together. Looking around the apartment one evening, Emily saw not the mess, but the love that filled every corner. 4 tiny beds, each with a sleeping baby, reminded her of how far she'd come. This wasn't the life she had planned, but it was the life she had built, with resilience, determination, and an unshakable love for her sons. Emily Parker had finally found a rhythm in her life. Raising 4 3-year-old boys, Noah, Liam, Ethan, and Owen, was no small feat, but she had managed to build a life filled with love and laughter. Each morning began with their endless energy, and each night ended with her collapsing onto the couch, exhausted but content. On a crisp autumn afternoon, Emily decided to take the boys to the park. It was their favorite spot, a place where they could run freely and climb to their heart's content. The boys raced ahead of her, their laughter ringing out as they chased one another through the falling leaves. Emily followed behind, a soft smile playing on her lips. She settled onto a bench near the playground, keeping a watchful eye on them as they explored. The cool breeze tugged at her hair, and for a moment, she allowed herself to relax. These moments of calm were rare, and she cherished them deeply. Meanwhile, Andrew Mason was walking through the park, lost in thought. A canceled meeting had left him with unexpected free time, and he had decided to clear his head with a stroll. His phone buzzed with incoming emails, but for once, he ignored it, letting the sound of rustling leaves and distant laughter fill the silence. As he approached the playground, a familiar laugh caught his attention. He turned his head, and for a moment he thought he was imagining things. But then he saw her. Emily. His breath caught as he stopped in his tracks, his gaze shifting from her to the 4 boys running in the playground. Their laughter, their energy, their faces, it was like looking into a mirror of his younger self. Andrew's mind raced. He didn't know how, but deep down, he knew the truth. Those boys weren't just any children. They were his. Emily noticed him seconds later. Her heart sank as her eyes locked with Andrew's. Panic threatened to consume her, but she forced herself to stay calm. Taking a deep breath, she rose from the bench and walked toward him. "Andrew," she said, her voice carefully even. "Emily," he replied, his tone heavy with disbelief. His eyes flicked to the boys and back to her. "Are they mine?" Emily's stomach churned. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind countless times, but nothing could prepare her for the reality of it. "They're mine," she said firmly, sidestepping his question. Andrew's gaze darkened. "Don't lie to me, Emily. They look just like me. All of them. You can't expect me to believe this is a coincidence." Emily crossed her arms, her voice sharp. "You left, Andrew. You made it clear that your career was more important than anything else. I've been raising them on my own, We don't need you. Andrew's jaw tightened. That's not your decision to make. If they're mine, I deserve to know. They deserve to know. Emily felt the weight of his words, but she refused to waver. It's not that simple. You can't just walk back into our lives after all this time and expect everything to fall into place. The tension hung heavy between them as they stared each other down. In the distance, the boys' laughter echoed, oblivious to the storm brewing around them. This isn't over, Andrew said quietly, his voice filled with determination. Emily turned away, calling out to the boys to get ready to leave. Her heart ached as she led them to the car, but she knew one thing for certain. Andrew wasn't going to let this go. Emily Parker nearly dropped the dish towel when a sharp knock echoed through her apartment. The evening had been calm, peaceful even, but that peace was shattered the moment she opened the door. Standing before her was a man in a sharp suit, holding an envelope. Emily Parker? Yes, she replied cautiously. He handed her the envelope. You've been served. Emily's heart sank as she took the envelope from his outstretched hand. The moment she opened it, the words seemed to leap off the page. Andrew Mason, the man who had walked away from her 3 years ago, was suing for custody of her 4 sons. Her knees felt weak as she collapsed onto the couch, staring at the legal summons. Andrew wasn't just seeking visitation rights, he was asking for full custody. Andrew's pivotal decision. Andrew sat in his office, staring at a file on his desk. It contained everything his legal team had dug up about Emily and the 4 boys he had seen in the park. The laughter of the children, the way they resembled him, it all haunted him. He couldn't ignore it anymore. I want custody of my boys, he said firmly, sitting across from Charlotte Reed in their dining room. Charlotte raised an eyebrow, setting her wine glass down with a soft clink. Are you sure about this? They're my sons, Andrew replied, his voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. I can't just stand by and pretend they don't exist. Charlotte leaned forward, her gaze sharp. You understand what this means, don't you? You're not just asking to see them, you're saying Emily isn't fit to raise them. Are you prepared for that? Andrew hesitated, his resolve faltering for a brief moment. I just want what's best for them. Charlotte's lips curled into a thin smile. Then let me help you. Sometimes doing the right thing means making hard choices. Emily prepares for battle. Emily sat across from her lawyer, Rachel, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the table. He doesn't know them, she said, her voice laced with frustration. He doesn't know their favorite bedtime stories or how Ethan is allergic to peanuts. I've been there for them through everything. He has no right to take them away. Rachel nodded calmly. I understand, Emily, but this isn't just about emotions. Andrew has money, and with Charlotte involved, they'll likely use their resources to make this a long, grueling fight. Emily's fists tightened at the mention of Charlotte. The memory of the woman's cold smile in the park resurfaced, fueling her anger. That woman has nothing to do with my kids, Emily said, her voice firm. Rachel reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand on hers. We'll fight this, but you need to be prepared. It's going to be a battle on all fronts. That evening, as Emily tucked Noah, Liam, Ethan, and Owen into bed, she sat for a moment watching them sleep. She kissed each of their foreheads and whispered, No one is going to take you away from me. Not now, not ever. Charlotte steps into the ring. On the other side of the battle, Charlotte began putting her own plans into motion. She wasn't just a bystander, she was fully involved. In a meeting with Andrew's legal team, she leaned back in her chair, exuding confidence. Emily Parker may love those boys, but love isn't enough. She's a struggling single mother living in a cramped apartment. Andrew and I can offer stability, education, and opportunities she can't even dream of. Her words were met with nods of agreement from the team. But Charlotte wasn't done. She reached out to her contacts in the media, planting subtle stories that painted Andrew and herself as benevolent figures. Articles began to circulate, highlighting Andrew's fight to rescue his sons from a difficult situation. Emily read those articles with mounting frustration. One headline in particular made her blood boil. Andrew Mason, a father fighting for his children. But as her anger grew, so did her determination. She knew this wasn't just a legal battle, it was a fight for her family. A tense ending. That evening, just as Emily was finishing the dishes, another knock sounded at her door. This time, it wasn't a process server. Standing there was Charlotte. "What are you doing here?" Emily asked, her voice sharp. Charlotte's smile was as cold as her tone was smooth. "I just wanted to say that this fight isn't just Andrew's. It's mine too. I'll make sure those boys have the future they deserve." Emily's hands tightened into fists, her anger barely contained. "You can try," she said, her voice steady, "but you'll never replace me." Charlotte's smile didn't falter. "We'll see." As Charlotte walked away, Emily closed the door, her heart pounding. The battle was no longer just about Andrew. It was about everything Emily had fought for, and she wasn't going to let anyone take it away. The day of the first custody hearing arrived, and Emily Parker felt as though the weight of the world rested on her shoulders. As she stood outside the courthouse, her lawyer Rachel at her side, Emily clenched her hands to stop them from shaking. "You've got this," Rachel said, her voice calm and steady. "Remember, you've done everything for your boys. No one can take that away from you." Emily nodded, drawing strength from Rachel's words. But as she stepped into the courtroom, her heart sank. Andrew Mason was already seated, flanked by his high-powered legal team. Beside him sat Charlotte Reed, impeccably dressed and exuding confidence. Her presence alone felt like a calculated move to remind everyone that she and Andrew were a united front. Emily took her place at the opposite table, determined to fight for her family. The opening arguments, Andrew's lawyer was the first to speak, painting a picture of a father who had made mistakes but was now seeking to rectify them. "Mr. Mason deeply regrets his past decisions," the lawyer began, his tone measured. "But he is here today because he wants to ensure his children have every opportunity in life. With his financial stability and support from his fiancée, he can provide the boys with a future that includes the best schools, extracurricular activities, and a stable home environment." Emily's stomach churned as the lawyer continued, subtly casting doubt on her ability to provide the same level of care. When it was Rachel's turn, she rose with quiet confidence. "Miss Parker has been the sole caregiver for her 4 sons since the day they were born. She has not only met their needs but has built a life filled with love, stability, and sacrifice. No amount of financial resources can replace the bond between a mother and her children." Emily felt a surge of pride as Rachel spoke, but she knew this was only the beginning. Charlotte takes the stand. One of the most unexpected moments of the day came when Charlotte was called to testify. Dressed impeccably, she walked to the stand with a grace that commanded attention. "I've seen how much Andrew cares for his sons," she said, her voice calm and measured. "He talks about them constantly, about how he wants to make up for lost time. Together we can give them opportunities they wouldn't otherwise have. Travel, education, experiences that will shape their futures." Rachel stood to cross-examine, her expression sharp. "Miss Reed, do you have any children of your own?" Charlotte hesitated for a fraction of a second before replying, "No, I don't." Rachel nodded. "So would you agree that raising 4 young boys is a unique challenge, one that requires more than just financial resources?" Charlotte's smile faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly. "I believe love and resources together create the best environment for children." Emily's turn. When Emily took the stand, she spoke with raw honesty. She described the sleepless nights, the sacrifices, and the unbreakable bond she had formed with her sons. "I've been there for every scraped knee, every fever, every first word," she said, her voice trembling but strong. "I may not have the money Andrew does, but my boys don't need wealth to thrive. They need stability, love, and the mother who has always been by their side." Andrew avoided her gaze as she spoke, but Charlotte watched her intently, her expression unreadable. Betty and Frank testify. Emily's neighbors, Betty and Frank, were next to take the stand. They painted a vivid picture of Emily's dedication as a mother. "Those boys are her whole world," Betty said, her voice filled with emotion. "I've seen her work late into the night to provide for them. She's done everything on her own, and she's done it with love." Frank added, "She's a fighter. Those kids don't need anyone else. They already have everything they need in her." The judge's observations. As the hearing stretched into the afternoon, the judge asked pointed questions to both sides. To Andrew, she inquired about his past decisions and what had changed. To Emily, she questioned how she would continue to manage the financial burden of raising 4 boys. Both sides presented compelling arguments, and by the end of the day, the courtroom was thick with tension. An unexpected twist. As the court recessed, Emily breathed a sigh of relief, though she knew the battle was far from over. But just as she was gathering her things, Charlotte approached her in the hallway. "You spoke well today," Charlotte said, her tone polite but distant. Emily narrowed her eyes. "What do you want?" Charlotte's expression turned cold. "Just to remind you, this isn't personal for me. It's about what's best for the boys. And if you cared about them as much as you say, you'd see that." Emily's anger flared, but she held her ground. "They don't need you, Charlotte, and they never will." Charlotte's lips curved into a faint smile. "We'll see about that." As Charlotte walked away, Emily felt a new surge of determination. This wasn't just a fight for custody. It was a fight for the life she had built for her sons. The courtroom buzzed with quiet tension as Emily Parker prepared to testify. She glanced at her lawyer, Rachel, who gave her a reassuring nod. Taking a deep breath, Emily stepped forward, her heart pounding. Across the room, Andrew Mason sat stiffly at his table. Beside him, Charlotte Reed exuded calm confidence, her sharp gaze fixed on Emily as if silently daring her to falter. Andrew, however, seemed less certain. His eyes flickered between Emily and Charlotte, his jaw tightening. Charlotte's calculated strategy. For weeks, Charlotte had meticulously planned every detail of their case. Her lawyer presented the narrative with precision. Emily, though well-meaning, was an overworked single mother barely keeping her head above water. "She's done her best," the lawyer began, his tone filled with feigned sympathy. "But the reality is, raising 4 children requires more than just effort. It requires resources, stability, and a support system. Mr. Mason, alongside Miss Reed, can provide all of that and more." Charlotte's lips curled into a satisfied smile as the lawyer outlined their argument. She leaned toward Andrew and whispered, "This is how we secure their future." Andrew didn't reply. Instead, he stared at Emily, who sat quietly, her hands clasped tightly together. Emily's testimony. When it was Emily's turn to speak, the room fell silent. Her voice wavered at first, but as she described her life with her boys, her confidence grew. "I've raised my sons on my own since the day they were born," she said, her voice strong and clear. "I've sacrificed everything, my career, my time, my own dreams, to make sure they're happy, healthy, and loved." Rachel approached the stand, her tone warm. "Emily, could you share a moment that captures your bond with your boys?" Emily smiled softly, her eyes glistening. "Every night before bed, we have a little tradition. We call it our thank you circle. Each of us takes turns saying one thing we're grateful for. Sometimes it's silly, like pancakes or new crayons, but most nights my boys say the same thing. Thank you, Mommy, for being here." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, even Charlotte's composed expression faltered. Andrew's internal conflict. As Emily spoke, Andrew felt a pang of guilt twisting in his chest. He remembered their first encounter at the park, the way Emily had smiled at the boys, her eyes filled with love. He had thought this fight was about giving them more, but now he wasn't so sure. Charlotte's voice broke through his thoughts during a recess. "Andrew, you can't afford to hesitate now," she said, her tone sharp. "If we lose, she keeps them, and you'll lose your chance to give them the life they deserve." Andrew stared at her, his mind racing. Was he doing this for the boys, or because Charlotte had convinced him it was the right thing? A sudden twist back in court. Charlotte's lawyer introduced a surprise witness, a pediatrician who had seen the boys during a routine checkup. The lawyer questioned whether Emily could continue managing their needs on her own. Emily's hands gripped the edges of her chair as the pediatrician spoke, her heart sinking. But when Rachel stood to cross-examine, her calm, methodical approach turned the tide. "Doctor," Rachel said, her voice steady, "based on your interactions with the boys, would you describe them as healthy, happy, and thriving?" The pediatrician hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, they are." Rachel smiled. "Thank you, no further questions." As the session ended for the day, Emily felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. But as she packed her things, Andrew approached her. "Emily," he began hesitantly, his voice low. She turned to face him, her expression guarded. "What is it, Andrew?" His gaze flickered toward Charlotte, who stood at a distance, her arms crossed. I need to know I'm doing the right thing." Emily's jaw tightened, but her voice remained steady. "If you truly care about them, Andrew, you'll see that tearing them away from me isn't it." The courtroom was tense as Andrew Mason rose to speak. He hadn't planned to testify, but something in Emily's words had struck a chord deep within him. "Your Honor," Andrew began, his voice steady but laden with emotion, "I've made mistakes. Mistakes that I'll regret for the rest of my life. I walked away when I shouldn't have, and in doing so, I abandoned not just Emily but my boys." Charlotte's sharp intake of breath was audible from across the room. She leaned toward their lawyer, whispering fiercely, but Andrew ignored her. His focus was on the judge, and more importantly, on Emily. "They are everything I thought I wasn't ready for," Andrew continued, his voice breaking slightly. "But sitting here today, hearing Emily speak about them, I realized something. She is everything a parent should be, loving, resilient, and selfless." Charlotte's reaction. At the defense table, Charlotte gripped the edge of her chair, her knuckles white. "What are you doing?" she hissed. Andrew turned slightly, meeting her gaze with a calm resolve. "What's right?" he said firmly. Charlotte's lips pressed into a thin line, her fury barely contained. As Andrew continued his testimony, she leaned back in her chair, calculating her next move. The judge's decision. After Andrew's unexpected testimony, the judge called for a brief recess. Emily sat at her table, her hands trembling slightly as Rachel leaned in. "This changes everything," Rachel said, her voice calm but triumphant. When the court reconvened, the judge spoke directly to Emily. "Miss Parker, your unwavering dedication to your children is evident. Combined with Mr. Mason's testimony, this court finds that the best place for the boys is with you. Full custody is granted to Miss Parker, with visitation rights for Mr. Mason." Emily's breath caught as relief washed over her. Tears welled in her eyes as she gripped Rachel's hand. For the first time in weeks, the weight on her chest lifted. A quiet truce. As the courtroom emptied, Andrew approached Emily cautiously. "Emily," he began softly, his voice stripped of the confidence he had shown earlier. She turned to face him, her expression guarded but not hostile. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything. You're an incredible mother, and I see that now. I just hope one day you can forgive me." Emily studied him for a moment, then nodded. "If you're serious about being in their lives, Andrew, it'll take time. But we can try. For them." Andrew's shoulders relaxed, a faint smile appearing on his face. "Thank you. That means more than you know." Charlotte's next move. While Emily and Andrew reached a tentative truce, Charlotte's fury boiled over. She stormed out of the courtroom, ignoring the reporters who shouted questions. Inside the car, she opened her phone, scrolling through her contacts. Her finger hovered over a name, someone influential, someone who owed her a favor. "This isn't over," she muttered to herself. Not by a long shot. Emily's moment of peace. That evening, Emily returned home with her boys. Their laughter filled the apartment as they raced through the living room, chattering about their favorite bedtime stories. As Emily tucked Noah into bed, he looked up at her with wide, curious eyes. "Mommy, are we staying together forever now?" Emily smiled, brushing his hair back. "Always, sweetheart," she whispered. As she closed the door to their room, Emily felt a wave of peace she hadn't known in years. She had fought for her family and won, and now they could finally move forward. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as the gavel struck, signaling the end of the custody case. Emily Parker gripped the edge of the table, her heart pounding as the judge spoke. "The court awards full custody of the children to Miss Emily Parker. Mr. Andrew Mason is granted limited visitation rights." For a moment, the words didn't sink in. Then relief washed over Emily like a wave, and tears welled up in her eyes. She had fought for her boys with everything she had, and now she had won. Across the room, Charlotte Reed sat frozen, her normally composed demeanor slipping. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and her fingers curled tightly around the edge of the table. She avoided looking at Andrew, who sat beside her with his head bowed. Charlotte's fury. As reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, Charlotte pushed her way through the crowd, her heels clicking sharply on the pavement. "Miss Reed, how do you feel about today's decision?" One reporter asked, shoving a microphone toward her. Charlotte stopped, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "The court made its ruling," she said evenly. "We respect the decision, but this isn't over." Her words hung in the air like a threat, but deep down Charlotte knew the truth. She had lost, and there was no coming back from it. A broken relationship. Later that evening, Charlotte confronted Andrew in the penthouse they shared. Her usually calm tone was laced with fury. "How could you do that?" she demanded, pacing the room. "You handed her everything on a silver platter." Andrew, sitting on the edge of the couch, ran a hand through his hair. "I did what was right, Charlotte. For the boys. This wasn't about us." Charlotte scoffed, her eyes narrowing. "You don't get it, do you? You've made me look like a fool. Everything I've worked for, everything we've built, it's all gone because you couldn't stick to the plan." Andrew stood, his expression firm but calm. "This was never about you, Charlotte. It's about them. And if you can't see that, then maybe we're not on the same page." Charlotte's voice dropped to a cold whisper. "Maybe we never were." The end of Charlotte and Andrew Panther. The next morning, Charlotte packed her belongings. Her movements were sharp and deliberate, each item carefully placed in a designer suitcase. Andrew stood by the window, watching the city skyline as she prepared to leave. "Is this how it ends?" he asked quietly, not turning to face her. Charlotte zipped her suitcase shut, her voice devoid of emotion. "It ended the moment you chose them over us." Without another word, she walked out of the penthouse, leaving Andrew alone in the silence. For the first time in years, Andrew felt the weight of his decisions settle on him. He had lost Charlotte, but for once, he felt like he had made the right choice. Emily's new normal. Meanwhile, Emily's life slowly began to return to normal. The boys thrived in the stability she had fought so hard to protect. Their laughter filled the small apartment, and Emily cherished every moment. One evening, as Betty helped her fold laundry, she said, "You've been incredible through all of this, Emily. I don't know how you did it." Emily smiled, her eyes softening. "I just did what any mother would do. They're my whole world." But even as Emily enjoyed the peace she had worked so hard to create, she couldn't ignore the lingering presence of Andrew. The weeks following the court's decision were a mix of relief and adjustment for Emily Parker. The boys' laughter echoed through their small apartment, a sound Emily cherished more than ever. But even as life began to settle, Andrew Mason's presence loomed, carefully respectful of the boundaries Emily had set. Andrew's first visit. On a sunny Saturday morning, Andrew arrived for his first scheduled visitation. He stood outside the apartment door, clutching a box of toys he had bought for the boys. Inside, Emily hesitated before opening the door. When she finally let him in, Andrew offered a tentative smile. "Thanks for letting me come," he said. "The boys are in the living room," Emily replied, stepping aside. In the living room, Noah, Liam, Ethan, and Owen stopped playing and stared at Andrew. Their faces reflected a mix of curiosity and hesitation. Andrew knelt down, holding out the box. "I brought something for you guys." Noah, the boldest of the four, stepped forward. He peeked inside, pulling out a model airplane. "Cool," he exclaimed, breaking the ice. The other boys followed, their initial shyness fading as they explored the gifts. Emily watched from the doorway, her arms crossed, her protective instincts still intact. Challenges in rebuilding bonds. Over the next few weeks, Andrew worked hard to reconnect with his sons. Each visit was an opportunity to learn about their personalities and routines. But it wasn't always smooth. One afternoon during a soccer game at the park, Ethan tripped and scraped his knee. As he cried, Emily instinctively started toward him, but Andrew got there first. "You're okay, buddy," Andrew said gently, brushing dirt off Ethan's knees. Ethan sniffled. "It hurts." Andrew ruffled his hair. "That's because you're brave. Brave kids always feel it a little more." Emily stopped in her tracks, watching Andrew comfort Ethan. A flicker of hope sparked in her heart, but it was tempered by caution. Emily's concerns. Despite Andrew's efforts, Emily remained guarded. One evening, after a visit, she finally voiced her concerns. "You've been consistent so far," she said, her tone calm but firm. "But this isn't just about showing up for a few weeks, Andrew. They need to know you're in it for the long haul." Andrew nodded, his expression serious. "I understand, Emily. I can't change what I did before, but I'm here now. I'm not going anywhere." Emily studied him for a moment before nodding. "For their sake, I hope that's true." The boys began to trust. As the months passed, the boys started to warm up to Andrew. One evening during a visit, Noah asked, "Will you come to my school play next week?" Andrew's eyes lit up. I wouldn't miss it for the world. Emily overheard the exchange from the kitchen, her emotions swirling. She wanted the boys to have a relationship with their father, but the fear of him letting them down lingered. A quiet evening. That night, as Emily sat on the couch with a book, Noah climbed onto her lap. "Mommy," he asked sleepily, "is Daddy going to come back tomorrow?" Emily stroked his hair, her heart swelling with emotion. "Not tomorrow, sweetheart, but he'll be back soon. He loves you very much." Noah nodded, his small hands clutching her shirt as he drifted off to sleep. Sitting there in the quiet, Emily whispered to herself, "This is enough. This is what we fought for." Months had passed since the courtroom battle, and Emily Parker had finally found her footing. Life wasn't perfect, but for the first time in years, she felt like she was moving forward. Not just surviving, but thriving. A career reborn. As a freelance writer, Emily had always worked tirelessly to provide for her boys. But now, with the stability of their future secured, she allowed herself to dream bigger. She started pitching her work to national publications, pouring her heart into essays about resilience, motherhood, and overcoming challenges. Her writing struck a chord with readers, and soon, invitations to write for major websites began pouring in. One morning, as she balanced coffee in one hand and a stack of drafts in the other, her phone buzzed. An email from a prominent parenting magazine lit up her screen. "We'd like to feature your story in our upcoming issue," the message read. Emily froze, rereading the words. This was her chance, a validation of the sacrifices she had made. She glanced at her boys, who were busy building a fort out of cushions in the living room. A soft smile spread across her face. "This is for us," she thought. A home filled with love. At home, life was as lively as ever. Even in their small apartment, Emily had created a space filled with warmth and laughter. On Saturday mornings, the boys helped her make pancakes, each one flipping their own with varying degrees of success. The kitchen would be a mess by the end, but Emily didn't mind. "Mommy, I made a smiley face," Ethan exclaimed, pointing at his pancake decorated with chocolate chips. Emily laughed, ruffling his hair. "That's perfect, sweetheart. Let's see if it tastes as good as it looks." In the evenings, they gathered for bedtime stories, each boy choosing a favorite book. It was their routine, a reminder of the love that held them together. Andrew's role in their lives. While Emily built her independence, Andrew Mason remained a steady presence. True to his word, he showed up for every scheduled visitation, slowly earning back the trust of his sons and Emily. One afternoon, after a park visit, Noah ran up to Emily with excitement. "Mommy, Daddy taught me how to make this airplane," he said, holding up a paper creation. Emily smiled, her emotions conflicted. She was glad Andrew was trying, even if it meant navigating the complexities of co-parenting. Emily's growing community. Outside of her family, Emily found support in her community. Betty and Frank, her kind-hearted neighbors, continued to lend a hand, often inviting her and the boys over for cookies and stories. "You're doing a wonderful job, Emily," Betty said one evening as she watched the boys play. Emily smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I just want to give them the best life I can." Balancing independence and co-parenting. Although Andrew played a role in their lives, Emily remained steadfast in her independence. She made it clear that while they shared parenting responsibilities, her life and decisions were hers alone. During a drop-off, Andrew hesitated before leaving. "Emily," he said, "you're doing an amazing job. I hope you know that." Emily nodded, her tone polite but firm. "Thank you, Andrew, but I didn't do this for your approval. I did it for them and for me." Andrew smiled faintly, recognizing her strength. Emily Parker stood alone in her kitchen, a cup of coffee forgotten in her hands as the weight of the day settled on her shoulders. The house was quiet, except for the soft laughter of her 4 boys in the other room. Despite the peace that filled her home, she couldn't shake the uncertainty that had been lingering in her mind for the past few days. It had been months since the courtroom drama that changed everything, and though Emily had learned to adapt, she still found herself questioning everything at times. Was she really enough for her children? Could she raise them well, despite the challenges they faced without Andrew Mason's presence in their lives? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the doorbell. Emily's heart raced. She had not expected anyone, especially not Andrew. When she opened the door, there he was, standing on her porch with an apologetic look on his face. His once confident stance seemed uncertain, his expression filled with remorse. "Hi, Emily," Andrew said quietly, stepping forward as if testing the waters. Emily took a deep breath. The last time she'd seen him, things had ended bitterly. There had been so many unanswered questions, so much hurt. But now, as she looked at him, she noticed the subtle difference in him. A man who had lost more than he realized. "What do you want, Andrew?" she asked, her voice firm, but the crack in it betrayed her emotions. Andrew hesitated for a moment, then spoke. I just wanted to see you, to talk about the kids." His voice trailed off as he glanced down at the ground, clearly uncomfortable. Emily folded her arms, her gaze unwavering. "The kids are fine, Andrew. They're happy." Her words came out sharper than she intended, but the truth was the thought of him coming back into their lives, even if just to apologize, stirred something deep inside her. She had worked so hard to give her children the life they deserved, and that life didn't include the man who had abandoned them when they needed him most. "I know," Andrew said softly, lifting his eyes to meet hers. "But I've been thinking a lot. About what happened, about everything. I made a mistake, Emily. I wasn't there when they needed me. I wasn't there when you needed me." The vulnerability in his voice made Emily pause. She had spent so much time fighting to rebuild their lives, to protect her sons from the chaos that Andrew's absence had caused, that she hadn't allowed herself to really process what his departure had done to him. "You don't get to just come back and fix everything," she said, her voice steady but full of emotion. "You left us when we needed you most, and now you think showing up is going to make it all better?" Andrew stepped closer, his voice desperate now. "I'm not asking you to forget what I did. I'm asking for a chance to be a part of their lives. I want to be there for them, Emily. I want to be the father they deserve." Emily's heart ached. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, the man he used to be, a man she had once loved deeply. But the past was the past, and the future, their future, was something she could control. She had done it alone for so long, and now her priorities had changed. Her children's well-being came first. "You want to be their father?" Emily asked, her tone calm but resolute. "Then show me you can be one. Prove it, not with words, but with actions. Show up for them. Be there for them. They're not a project for you to fix when it's convenient. They're my sons, Andrew, and they deserve consistency, love, and respect. Things you should have given them from the start." Andrew remained silent, his eyes filled with regret. It was clear to Emily that he had come seeking redemption, but redemption wasn't hers to give. The life they had built together was in the past. What mattered now was the family she had created with her boys, the family that, despite everything, had thrived. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of their history hung between them, unspoken yet palpable. Then, finally, Andrew spoke again, his voice soft but filled with resolve. "I'll try, Emily. I'll try to be there for them. I can't undo what I did, but I can be better. I just want them to know I'm here." Emily nodded, her expression softening slightly. She could see that he was trying, but she wasn't ready to let him back into their lives just yet. The healing process would take time. She had to see if he could live up to the promises he was making. "I'll hold you to that," she said, her voice steady. "But remember, Andrew, I am their mother, and I always will be. No one can take that away from me, not even you." Andrew gave a small nod, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be a smooth road back into their lives. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like he might actually have a chance to make things right. As he turned to leave, Emily stood at the door, watching him walk away. It wasn't a farewell, not yet, but it was a step in a new direction, one where she was no longer weighed down by the past. She had done it. She had built a life for her boys, for herself, and now she was taking the next step. Whatever happened with Andrew, she was ready to face it. She had her children, her career, and her independence. And that, Emily knew, was enough. The final message, the strength of motherhood and resilience. As the sun set over Seattle, casting a warm, golden hue across the skyline, Emily Parker sat on her porch, watching her 4 boys play in the yard. The laughter of Noah, Liam, Ethan, and Owen echoed in the air, their carefree joy a sharp contrast to the hardships Emily had faced in the past. It had been a long road to get here, filled with heartbreak, betrayal, and countless challenges, but she had made it. They had made it. At this moment, Emily realized that the strength she had drawn on to survive had not just been her own. It had been the love for her children, the fierce, unyielding love that pushed her forward every day, no matter how hard life became. Her journey had been filled with pain, but it had also been filled with hope. And now, with her boys by her side, she knew she had found the peace she had once thought impossible. It was easy to forget, looking at the life she had built now, that it had all started with a heartbreak. When Andrew Mason had left her just before their wedding, Emily felt as though her world had crumbled. The man she had trusted with her heart, the father of her children, had walked away. At that moment, the future had seemed uncertain. How could she raise 4 children on her own? How would she survive the cruel judgment of society, who often looked at single mothers with skepticism and pity? But Emily didn't have the luxury of sinking into despair. There was no time for self-pity. There were children to care for, bills to pay, and a life to rebuild. She had always been strong, but it was in those dark, sleepless nights that she discovered the full extent of her own resilience. She worked long hours as a freelance writer, often burning the midnight oil, while her boys slept soundly in the rooms she had decorated with love and care. She didn't have the luxury of being defeated. Her children depended on her. She remembered the days when she'd hold her sons in her arms, wondering how she could possibly make it all work. And then, slowly, it all came together. She found success in her career, creating a steady stream of work that allowed her to provide for her family. More importantly, she was able to create a home filled with love, support, and laughter. Andrew had tried to come back into their lives. He showed up at the door, apologizing, asking for forgiveness. But Emily knew that forgiveness wasn't something that could be given lightly. She had given him her trust once, and it had been broken. But, despite everything, she had no intention of keeping her children from knowing their father, especially when they expressed a desire to reconnect with him. The hardest part, Emily realized, was learning to forgive. It wasn't about excusing Andrew's past mistakes, but about finding a way to move forward. As much as she wanted to keep her distance, for her own sake and the sake of her children, she understood that they needed closure. The process was slow. Emily wasn't ready to welcome Andrew back into her life right away, and she certainly wasn't ready to forget the pain he had caused. But for the sake of her children, she allowed him to be a part of their lives, slowly, cautiously, but steadily. In the end, Emily realized that forgiveness didn't mean erasing the past. It meant choosing not to let it dictate the future. And in that process, she found her own peace. She could live her life with love, not fear. She could raise her children without resentment weighing on her heart. She could move forward. Her boys, too, were growing up in a world that now seemed brighter, full of opportunity and love. They had each other, and they had Emily, their mother, their protector, their constant source of strength. In her heart, Emily knew that motherhood was more than just giving birth to children. It was about showing them how to live, how to love, and how to overcome whatever life threw at them. Through her example, she had taught them that resilience was not about enduring the pain, but about rising above it. It was about forging a better future, one step at a time, with love at the center of it all. And in the end, that was the greatest gift she could ever give. Her strength, her unwavering devotion to her children, and her ability to build a future that was full of hope, those were the true measures of her success. If you've enjoyed Emily's incredible journey of resilience, motherhood, and forgiveness, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. By subscribing,